Greetings, my lovable weirdos, and welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, hi, welcome. I'm Tilly, and you can follow me on Instagram at TillyCXZ to get updates on this channel, or if you're curious as to how I do my makeup. Or you can also follow me at MatildaCXZ if you're curious about my life outside of YouTube. If you're a returning subscriber, I just want to take this moment to thank you all for your response to this new series and this new format, both on this channel and on Instagram. It's been mostly positive so far, and I'm really glad you guys are enjoying it. Special shout out to Victoria Ann, who has been super supportive of this channel through its various phases, and who has some suggestions on what I should cover next. I'm working on that at the moment, so keep an eye out for the episode coming sometime soon. You may notice that I'm trying to speak really softly because I'm actually still traveling, and the place that I'm staying in has kind of thin walls and thin ceilings, so I'm trying not to disturb people living above me. For this week's episode, we're taking a look at a horror novel that was apparently based on true events that happened in the author's life. In fact, because the story hits so close to home, he actually considers this the most frightening book he's ever written, and he didn't even want to publish it. This week, I'm talking about Stephen King's Pet Sematary. Warning: the following presentation contains references to the paranormal, death, and spoilers for the book and movie Pet Sematary. Viewer discretion is advised. Stephen Edwin King is an American author who writes in a range of genres, including supernatural, suspense, crime, science fiction, and fantasy. But he's probably best known as the King of Horror. Born in Portland, Maine in 1947, Stephen King has published around 64 fiction novels, 5 non-fiction books, and around 200 short stories. He's sold over 350 million copies of his books and has been the recipient of multiple Bram Stoker Awards, British Fantasy Society Awards, and World Fantasy Awards. His works have been adapted into comic books, TV series, miniseries, and movies. That's a really impressive resume. So you'd think it'd take a pretty special story to scare even the king of horror himself.
In Pet Sematary, for long periods of time, I just felt very, very wired and very uncomfortable with what I was writing about.
Published on November 14th, 1983, Pet Sematary tells the story of Louis Creed, a doctor from Chicago who moves his young family to the small town of Ludlow, Maine, after his appointment as director of the University of Maine's Campus Health Service. From the moment they arrive at the new home, things don't exactly go well. Louis's daughter Eileen, affectionately called Ellie, ends up hurting her knee, and his son Gage gets stung by a bee. Their elderly new neighbor, Jud Crandall, comes over to help with the crying children, and he warns Louis and his wife Rachel to keep an eye on their kids, as the road that ran by their new home was a busy highway that frequently had trucks speeding down it. If you're thinking a family with young kids living right by a highway with speeding vehicles sounds like a recipe for disaster, you'd be right. The people who live above me at home, you can hear them not stomping, but like the floors are thin. They're like super thin. Before we take a look at the tragedies that befall the Creed family, I need to talk about 2 other significant events that happen in the book, as they do influence certain decisions made by characters later down the line. The first of these events is the death of Victor Pascow, a university student who was fatally injured in a vehicular accident. Louis is by Pascow's side when he dies, and he ends up having this strange dream where Pascow's ghost warns him against going beyond the back of the pet cemetery that laid in the woods behind his new home. The second event is when Jud's wife Norma suffers a near-fatal heart attack, but with Louis's help, she ends up making a quick recovery. Right, now that I've mentioned those 2 events, let's go back to the Creeds. The highway's first casualty is Winston Churchill, or Church, Ellie's cat. This happens when Rachel and the children are in Chicago visiting her parents. Now, because of what Louis did for Norma, and because Judd knew that Ellie loved Church, he decides to show Louis the real cemetery where he can bury Church. This ends up being an ancient Native American burial ground beyond the back of the pet cemetery that, remember, Pascow's ghost had warned Louis not to go to. According to the story, the burial grounds were used by the Mi'kmaq tribe, a real First Nations tribe that are indigenous to parts of eastern Canada, Quebec, and the northeast region of Maine. That same afternoon, after Louis buries Church, the cat comes back to the Creed home. Alive, but there's something off about it. Church starts killing smaller animals, seemingly for fun. viciously ripping them apart without eating them. And he also smells really bad, to the point where Ellie no longer wanted him sleeping in her room. Unfortunately, a couple of months later, the highway claims yet another victim. This time, it's 2-year-old Gage Creed. Understandably, the Creed family is distraught. And then Lewis remembers what happened when he buried Church in the burial grounds beyond the Pet Sematary. And in his grief, he thinks, if it worked for the cat, maybe there was a way of bringing his son back. So Lewis exhumes Gage's body from where he's already been buried, carries him through the woods, and reburies him behind the Pet Sematary. And just like Church, Gage comes back. And just like Church, he's no longer his normal, sweet little self. And from this point on, things just keep on going from bad to worse, and more people end up dying. Now you're probably wondering, Tilly, what parts of the story could possibly be based on true events? Surely not the reanimation of dead bodies. And no, as far as I know, that part's not real. What was real, though, was that, like Lewis Creed, Stephen King had moved his family to a small town in Maine called Orrington instead of Ludlow after he got a job as a writer-in-residence at the University of Maine. In a 2019 interview with Entertainment magazine, King says, quote, "We rented this nice house on the river, and a pet cemetery was in back of it. There was a path that went up there that kids kept mowed. It was a really nice place." End quote. Like in the novel, the house was also near a very busy road, and King's daughter Naomi had a cat just like Ellie. Unfortunately, just like Church, Naomi's cat, named Smuggy, also fell victim to the speeding cars on that road. Naomi was apparently around 9 or 10 years old when Smuggy died, and her reaction to her cat's death inspired some of Ellie's lines in the book. Quote, "My daughter's cat died, and we buried it in the Pet Sematary. That was Smuggy. She made a little cross that said, 'Smuggy, he was obedient.' And I mean, he was a cat. He wasn't effing obedient, but she loved that cat. That night, after we buried it, we heard her out in the garage. She was jumping up and down on those popper things that they wrap fragile stuff in. She was shouting, 'God can't have my cat. That cat is my cat. Let him have his own cat.' And I put all that in the book." End quote. That scene didn't just make it into the book. When Pet Sematary was adapted into a movie in 1989, both that scene and Smuggy's grave marker made it in too.
Well, if it was up to me, I'd let Church live to be 100, but I don't make up the rules.
Oh, who does? God, I suppose. He's not God's cat, he's my cat. But God gets own if he wants one. Not mine. Not mine.
So King's daughter Naomi inspired parts of the character of Ellie. But what about Gage? Turns out, the tragedy that claimed Gage's life very nearly happened to King's son Owen. And that close call made him think about all the what-ifs. What if his son had died? What if there was a way to bring him back? What would happen then?
Well, tell me, there's an interesting story that goes behind Pet Sematary and how you came up with the idea for the novel. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, almost everything that's in the novel and in the movie, up to a certain point, really happened. The novel concerns a doctor and his family that move into a town in Maine. He's going to become the doctor at the local infirmary. And in my case, I moved into a small Maine town to become writer-in-residence at the same university. The character in the book has a little boy. I have a little boy. My daughter had a cat that she loved very much, and the little girl in the book has a cat. In both cases, there was a pet cemetery behind the house where the main characters, the real ones, my family, and the fictional ones, the Creed family, lived. And my daughter's cat was run over in the road. There was a lot of heavy traffic, a lot of big fertilizer trucks that went back and forth. And she was very upset. It was her first experience with death. And about 6 months later, my little boy almost ran into that road while a truck was coming. And this started to tick over in my head when I thought about how close it had been, and the result was Pet Sematary.
On his website, King says, quote, "I can remember crossing the road and thinking that the cat had been killed in the road. And what if a kid died in that road And we had had this experience with Owen running toward the road, where I had just grabbed him and pulled him back, and the two things just came together. On one side of this 2-lane highway was the idea of what if the cat came back, and on the other side of the highway was what if the kid came back, so that when I reached the other side, I had been galvanized by the idea, but not in any melodramatic way. I knew immediately that it was a novel, end quote. Despite being struck by inspiration and admitting that he had, quote, the greatest time writing the book, end quote, once he was done, King thought that it was an awful story because of how dark it was. Because ultimately, Pet Sematary is a book about grief and how people handle or don't handle it. Allegedly, when King completed the first draft of Pet Sematary in May of 1979, he had put the manuscript away in a drawer, and if he had had his way, he would have never published it. However, he was locked in a rather exploitative contract with the publishing company Doubleday, who was raking in all the royalties from his best-selling novels, including Carrie, Salem's Lot, and The Shining. Even when King had switched publishers, the way the contract worked out made it so that Doubleday could keep on collecting all those royalties from those novels and only pay King $50,000 a year. And he was actually willing to write off all that potential income because he didn't want to deal with Doubleday at all. But his lawyer advised him that the contract was written in such a way that if anything were to happen to King, his family could potentially end up being stuck paying all the taxes on the substantial royalties that Doubleday were collecting, because technically that was his income, even though he and his family weren't seeing a single cent of it. So in order to protect his family, King offered Doubleday the manuscript for Pet Sematary under the condition that they break the previous contract that they had with him. Considering that negative situation with Doubleday and the strong feelings King already had about this story, it's surprising then that he was the one who wrote the screenplay for the movie adaptation in 1989. When asked why he would do that, this was what he said, quote, sometimes you say to yourself, maybe I can take this and make it a little bit better, or maybe I just want to face the thing that scares me the most. So I went in and I wrote it, end quote. Despite the 1989 movie being a blockbuster success, it actually received a lot of mixed reviews from critics, with some giving it 4 out of 5 stars and calling it one of the best King adaptations, while others gave it 0 out of 5 stars and thought it was sickening. A critic for the Washington Post found Gage's character and what he does after he comes back from the cemetery disturbing, and not in a good way, which I think is the entire point of those scenes. Personally, I actually really like the 1989 movie, probably more than the 2019 remake, because, in my opinion, what makes Pet Sematary a scary story isn't so much the supernatural element, but the human fallibility. But what do you think? If you were in Louis Creed's shoes, would you have made the same decisions? I like to think that I've seen enough horror movies to know that that's a horrible idea, but honestly, I don't know. But that's it for this month's episode. Until next time, stay safe out there, take care of each other, and remember to keep on embracing your inner weirdo. Bye!